Okay. So you've said that one of your moral axioms is that pain is bad, and so we should work to eliminate unnecessary suffering. Isn't this the basis for a secular morality like utilitarianism? And can't we therefore be moral without religion?
Well, I don't think that it's, first of all, probably to the first question, but that's also, that derivation is predicated on the idea that that's the only idea, that I'm putting forward as an ethical idea, and it's not. If that was the only idea, well, then you could derive from that a fairly straightforward brand of utilitarianism. But also, I think, to push the argument in that direction also necessitates the reduction of what might constitute pain to something too unidimensional, because I think suffering is a better term than pain, although pain in some sense is at the core of suffering. Suffering is a multidimensional phenomena, and I don't think that you can draw a simple utilitarian argument from that, either the existence of suffering or the observation that it's the reduction of unnecessary suffering might be a good thing. So I'm also leery of those. See, it's not reasonable in some sense to reduce a complex set of ideas to a single proposition, and then say the ideas that I've been putting forward, and then to reduce another complex philosophical set of ideas to a single proposition, and then say, aren't those two things the same? And they are once you reduce them to the two simple axioms, or you could argue that they're the same, but I would say there's a tremendous amount left out in the telling, and that what's left out is relevant. It kind of reminds me of those philosophical games that psychologists often play. It's like, well, if there was, I think what's the one, I don't know if I can recall this properly. It's the trolley cart problem. Something like, if there was a train that was out of control and it was going towards 6 people on one track, would you flip a switch so it switched tracks and only killed one person? Would you do that? And I read a question like that and I think, that's a stupid question. And the reason I think that is because you can't take a situation like that and render it properly by reducing it to that question. And then you also can't assume that the person who answers that question would in fact act in the way they answered. You can't presume any of that. It's like, because in a situation like that, in a high stress situation like that, the devil is in the details. And I've dealt with situations like that a number of times and know perfectly well that the devil's in the details. So I think that there's an intellectual reduction to make a philosophical point that doesn't give the complexity of the topic justice. And then there was a second part to that, which was, and therefore can't we be moral without religion? Well, I would say that question also suffers in some sense from the same problem of formulation. I'm very hesitant ever to answer a question of the form, is A merely a manifestation of B, when A and B are very complex things? Because the answer to that is, it depends on what you mean by moral and what you mean by religious. Because, see, there's an underlying intellectual maneuver in a question like that. And the underlying maneuver is the a priori assumption that something as complex as religion or as complex as morality can be reduced to an object with a name. And that then two objects reduced to their name can be assessed simultaneously. And I don't think that that's the case. I think you can say something like, is a triangle a square? I think you can say that. But I don't think you can say, is it possible to have morality without religion? I don't think you can have that question, because it has to be expanded out. So it's like, what do you mean by morality exactly? And what do you mean by religion? Because maybe and maybe not. And so the answer to that question is to decompose the question. Oh, yeah.
I don't want my young children indoctrinated with dangerous ideas. And as time marches on, I trust public education less and less. I know that you have strong thoughts on the danger of the devouring Oedipal mother who harms her child by protecting them. And that's certainly not what I aspire to. I wonder if, in spite of your idea that kids need to become tough and learn to slay dragons, if you have anything good to say about the idea of homeschooling.
Well, I don't have anything bad to say about it. I do know that the Quebec government has recently taken moves to make it much more difficult for people to homeschool their children. And it's not like 5 years ago, 15 years ago, I would have presumed that the vast majority of people who were homeschooling their children were to be viewed with skepticism initially. I'm not so sure about that anymore. For example, I was sent a poster today. Someone sent me this link that they found in a local junior high school. And one of the media pieces that were recommended on this poster was a movie called Hedwig and the Angry Inch. Now, I thought that was a terrible movie, even though I'm perfectly capable of enjoying bizarre movies. But so it's a bizarre movie, that's for sure. But I also thought it was a terrible, bitter movie. Terrible and bitter. Those are separate. A movie can be bitter and be quite great, but it was a terrible movie and it was a bitter movie. But I can tell you one bloody thing about that movie. It's not required viewing for 12-year-old kids. That's for sure. So I think you have increasing reason to be skeptical of the public education system. I also looked at the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario's guidelines for education from kindergarten to grade 8, and what that is in essence, and I think I will do a video about it in the relatively near future, is a blueprint for transforming children into social justice warriors. It basically says that. It's like you don't have to be a conspiracy theory to read that. We have social justice tribunals in Ontario. And so the idea is, well, if you're going to get your children, if you're going to get people to, what would you say, favor equity properly, well, then you better start teaching them while they're young. It's like, maybe not. So now, you ask that question properly, because you say, well, the terrible education system, the wonderful mother homeschooling, right? That's the danger. It's like, no, because it might not be the wonderful mother homeschooling. It might be the pathological mother using the pathology of the education system as an excuse to get her talons into her children. Right, because that's certainly equally possible, or perhaps even more possible, because at least in the public education system, there's some necessity for consensus. So that's something that you have to be very aware of and work to prevent, right? And so I would say, if you're going to do that, probably best not to do it on your own. And it's like you need a board of advisors or something like that, and so maybe it can't just be you, and you have to figure out, well, what is the aim? And how are you going to manage that? And what makes you think you can do it? Even if it's being done badly publicly, what makes you think you could do it better? My general advice is, and people have asked me this, in fact, I had a conversation with the guy who was tiling my backyard this morning about something his son had said to him that he was taught at school recently, which really made the tiler, who had come from a rather authoritarian country, step back on his heels and think, I'm not so sure I should be sending my kid to public school anymore, and maybe I shouldn't be living in Toronto even, but my general advice is keep an eye on your kids and discuss with them what they're learning, and help equip them with the tools to not only to articulate their own viewpoint in response to what they're being taught. Now, the problem is you might not have the time nor the ability to do that. That's no simple thing. And increasingly, if you're unwilling to have your children participate in what is increasingly indoctrination and not education, thanks to, in no small part, to the Ontario Institute of the Studies on Education, which is an institution that I particularly despise, because I think that almost all it does now is produce indoctrinators of children. It's not an easy problem to solve. So more power to you wanting to put your children in a situation where they're not being indoctrinated. But the alternative is very, very complicated and difficult. So, yeah.
Dr. Peterson, thank you for the lecture. I was wondering, is there a shamanic basis to the story of Adam and Eve?
Likely. I would say, generally speaking, there's a shamanic basis to almost all the religious traditions, because that's the milieu out of which the religious traditions emerged. Now, I can't say much more than that because I don't know, and no one does, the particularities. I mean, you might say, well, is there an allusion to the ingestion of psychoactive chemicals in the Adam and Eve story? And people have made that case, and there's been powerful cases made. So there's a book, for example, I think it's called Soma by a guy named Gordon Wasson, who was the first person, an amateur mycologist, who was the first person to propose that the soma of the Hindus were Amanita muscaria mushrooms, which is actually those are the red mushrooms with the white dots that you always see on fairy tales, the cute ones. Toadstools. Flies like to eat them. They're called fly agaric also. And flies seem to like getting stoned. I know that's weird. I know that's a weird thing to say. But I have a good book on animal use of psychedelics, and more animals use them than you might think. But anyways, there is some evidence that, of use of the ingestion of fruits, let's say, metaphorically speaking, as an aid to the transformation of consciousness that goes back so far that, forever as far as human beings are concerned. But to specifically tie that to the Adam and Eve story, I haven't been able to see any evidence that would definitely link them. There's been a lot of interesting books written about that. There's one that was quite a kind of a weird hit I think in the late 60s, might have been early 70s. It sort of got brushed off as a hippie book, but it really wasn't. It's called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. That's the sort of book you read and you think, I don't know what to do about that. I have no idea what to do about that book. So that's all I can say about that. Yep.
My question's about martyrdom. So, what do you think martyrdom, or the willingness to suffer and die for what you believe, if anything, says of the convictions? And what do you think is the benefit for the martyr, which is at least traditionally immaterial and transcendent good, compared to the regular sacrifice or practical sacrifice, which is ordered to the future material, psychological, or economic good?
Man, you guys really come up with some wicked questions. I think it depends to some degree on how you define martyrdom. Because you could define it as the tendency to pathologically self-aggrandize yourself on public display. Or you could say it's the decision to be immovable about a set of principles, right? So let's go with that one. Forget about the first one. Well, I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, right? In some sense, that's a really tough one. People asked me, I'll make it personal, I suppose. People asked me when I first got involved with all this political controversy back in September, October Well, they asked me a couple of things. They asked me if this was the hill that I really would choose to die on. It was like pronouns and the transgender issue. Yeah, well, it's not one I would have picked, but I mean, it was about language, and that makes it non-trivial. And Bill C-16 was passed this week, as you know, and one of the things that was quite interesting about that, and I will answer your question, was that Brenda Kossman, who was the woman that I debated, I think it's one of the persons that I debated, didn't like to be referred to as a woman, but I didn't think it was Brenda. Anyways, she wrote an op-ed, and I believe it was in the Globe and Mail, but it might have been the National Post, saying, as I knew she would say, that Bill C-16 was just the beginning, right? That we have plenty of work left to do. And yes, you can bloody well be sure that we have plenty of work left to do. Anyways, I was asked during that period of time whether or not I was being a martyr, and I thought, well, it's not really one of my ambitions, it's like that sort of torn to the lions thing doesn't sound like exactly something you might aim for. But I think, well, sometimes you find out in your life, maybe, that there's something you won't do. And then maybe you just don't do it, no matter what the consequence is. Maybe, I don't know, because I haven't been pushed to that point, but there have been people who have been pushed to that point in history, and they've basically said, I don't care what you do to me, I'm not doing that. And, maybe some of them were suicidal and some of them were psychotic and some of them had whatever other problems that people might have. But yeah, I do have this suspicion now and then that some of them were just kind of serious about saying no. And there's some utility in being serious about saying no. And that sort of revealed itself to me, I suppose, to some degree back in September when I read a piece of legislation that said I would have to use some words that were legislated by the government. And I thought, there's no goddamn way I'm going to do that under any conditions that I can imagine. Now, there are conditions, and I have a pretty good imagination for unimaginable conditions. I couldn't see it because I thought that if I did that, I would break. Whatever would be left of me after having done that would no longer be me. And I'm not interested in that. I know what that would be like. I actually do know what that would be like. And I'm not interested in that. I would rather have whatever else happens happen. And people have said to me, well, you're so courageous for taking this stand. It's like, yeah, well, I'm not going to claim any sort of otherworld courage. I can tell you that. But one thing I do know the difference between is different forms of hell. Let's put it that way. And there's the hell that maybe I might be dragged through if I don't act in accordance with this law. And there's the hell that I would be dragged through if I did act in accordance with the law. And I would vastly prefer the first hell to the second, and it isn't clear to me that that actually constitutes courage. Is it useful? Because that's also the question about martyrdom. I think it's very useful for people to see that someone will say, there's no way, there's no conceivable way that you can get me to do that. And I've thought long and hard about such things too, because I've taught very many people to negotiate. And one of the things I always teach them is you don't negotiate from a position of weakness, because you lose. And so if I say no to something, and I mean no, I bloody well won't do it. And I think that if there are people who also agree that such things aren't appropriate, to have the example of someone who says no and means it actually turns out to be useful. And so then I would say, well, that's an inclination in the potential direction of martyrdom. But I don't see how to distinguish that from actually just having the courage of your convictions. And so sometimes you might say, well, a person who has sufficient courage in their convictions will sometimes be put to death. Well, if that's the definition of a martyr, then sometimes, but not always, that's a really good thing. And one of the things I really liked about Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, which is I refer to it often, is an absolutely staggering book, is that he put in many, many stories of people who were in the Gulag, and they were often religious believers, which was a shock to him because he was an atheistic communist when he first entered the camps. They were often religious believers, and they were people who said no. There were things they would not do. They would not participate in what the regime was asking them to do. And you have to read it because the devil's in the stories, right? The details in the stories. But Solzhenitsyn in the camps grew to have tremendous admiration for such people and actually viewed them as exemplars of the mode of being that was necessary for him to escape both the communist propaganda that had shaped him as an individual and also the terrible bitterness and sorrow and anger that he experienced as a consequence of being flung into the terrible concentration camp conditions of the Gulag Archipelago. So, yeah.
Hey, Doc. Thanks for staying alive and potentially saving humanity. Yeah, that's good stuff. Wondering about a couple things. Firstly, who won that childhood fight? You kind of let that just slide, so I'm thinking it was a big L.
Well, I can tell you because he was a tough little kid. See, I don't remember what happened, but my remembrance of him was that he pound me out pretty effectively. So, yeah. His name was Vernon Switchenook. Yeah, he was a good friend of mine, and I think Vernon still lives in Fairview. So if he hears of this, then maybe he'll remember that too, and so probably he would have won. I didn't win that many physical fights when I was a kid, so.
Okay, that's not the only question. So
okay.
Okay. Anyway, cool. I'm not sure if you've actually been asked this before. I've missed the last two lectures, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on Tolkien, J.R. Tolkien, and his work, not just Lord of the Rings, but the Silmarillion, which is basically like I'm seeing all this and I'm thinking it's like the modern Bible in a way. It's got the weird names like Tubal-Cain and all that stuff, and specifically when we were talking about Cain just now and how he was, this thing's just moving. When he was talking about how he felt like betrayed by God, and he spent his whole life working to spite him essentially, and he kind of set the path forward for the darkness in humanity. That's almost exactly Melkor, which was in the Silmarillion, basically what spawned everything evil in Middle Earth and Mordor and whatnot. And I don't even know as much as some people go on.
Tolkien was a student of mythology, and the story of the Hobbit is a retelling of Beowulf in large part, and that's a dragon slaying myth, and so the reason that Tolkien and Rowling, for that matter, are so popular is because they've done a very good job of making the old myths new. And well, look what's happened with the Marvel series. It's the same thing, and with Star Wars and all of that, is that you can't not respond to these stories. Now, you're going to find them in one form or another, and sometimes, well, with the biblical stories, for example, the meaning of the mythological content has become invisible. That's partly the death of God that Nietzsche was referring to. But that doesn't mean that the stories themselves vanish because people have an eternal hunger for them. Now, the problem with them emerging in, let's say, more literary or less sophisticated form, let's take the Marvel movies as an example, is that they're not surrounded by an articulated culture the same way the biblical stories are. So, for example, they're not surrounded by something like Paradise Lost by John Milton, or Dante's Inferno, which are works of unlimited depth. And so you throw away something of great value and reacquire it in a different place with less value, perhaps, but more comprehensibility. It's not a great trade. That is not a critique of Tolkien. It's not a critique of anybody who's drawing on mythological stories for their narratives. You have to do that to be a good storyteller, but it's nice to go as close to the source as you can as well. So, yeah. And the overlaps that you describe, well, yeah, it's exactly what you'd expect, because if you deal with great mythological themes, you start to get... The archetypes are at the bottom of stories. And so if the story goes down far enough, it runs into the archetypes. And that was Jung's claim, and I think he got that exactly right. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Last one.
There's a passage in Paradise Lost where the demons are building pandemonium under Mammon's sort of guidance, and they crack open what's not really earth but hell, and they take out the gold and they build pandemonium, which is the most sophisticated architectural wonder of all time in Milton's language. And this conception of taking material and turning it into a temple to oneself was interpreted by Humphrey Jennings, who was the founder of the mass observation movement. And if anyone saw the opening to the Britain's 2012 games, the history of the Industrial Revolution, he said, was encapsulated by this passage in Milton, where you have demons building a temple for themselves out of matter, and that mankind, in Milton's language, was taught to do this, or they learned it first by this example. And he says, "Let none envy that devils have riches in hell." And I see things in this. One, the Gnostic idea that somehow the world itself that we inhabit is hell, and that matter is not our true place of existence, but somewhere sort of Platonic. And also the Faustian sort of bargain that people made around 1666 to get a world of stuff and things and possessions by losing the soul, or what existed before that. And I wonder if I play with that a lot in my own thought, and I wonder if that's something that you found in Milton, and what you think of that passage in particular.
Well, Milton was definitely a prophetic voice, right? And I think that's a perfectly reasonable retelling of that section. It's also very much akin to the story of the Tower of Babel, I think we'll talk about next week. Now, see, the problem, God, it's so complicated. See, one of the things that Jung said about the transformation of the first millennium of Christianity into, let's say, the second millennium of Christianity was that Christianity had promised something like redemption, universal redemption from suffering, maybe in the afterlife, but that was kind of a cop-out, let's say, because it didn't really solve the problem of suffering here and now. And Jung believed that as people had, although it did many positive things, let's not forget that. It civilized people in a way that they hadn't been before, or you could make that case. But then there's this underground, at the same time there's this denial of the utility of material reality that went along with the spiritualization of mankind in that Christian millennium. There was value left in material because it had been ignored. And so then Jung believed that the collective unconscious, broadly speaking, began to be attracted to what had been rejected by the hyper-spiritualization, and started to question whether or not additional value could be extracted from the material, maybe as a adjunct to the spiritual, because maybe true redemption was something like a proper meeting of the spiritual and the material, which wasn't something that seemed to be part and parcel of Christian doctrine up to that point. Now, maybe what Milton was warning against was a swing too far, right? And I think Milton's point is well taken, because one of the things that's worth noting is that you can be perfectly miserable in a house of gold, right? I mean, I've known very many wealthy people, very, very wealthy people. And the problem, see, the thing is that money just doesn't solve that many problems that people have. People wish it would. People who want to be rich think it will, and the people who want to redistribute money think it will. And I know that there's nothing to be said for abject poverty, but the problem is that there are many serious problems that human beings have that material comfort alone does nothing to address, or almost nothing. You can have a perfectly miserable family life and $20 million. And the buffer that the $20 million puts between you and the misery sometimes it's not even a buffer, it's a magnifier. So Milton would warn against the creation of even the idea of a material utopia. Even in principle, something Dostoevsky also recognized as an error. You cannot solve the problem in that manner. And maybe the demonic idea is propaganda that you could. Now maybe there is a balance of some sort, because I don't understand if we were going to build the city of God, let's say. Well, a huge part of the endeavor would have to be spiritual. And to me, a huge part of that would be, it would have to be something predicated, if not on truth, at least on the willingness of people not to lie to one another. Without that, all the material well-being in the world it's a facade. It's like gilding a corpse, right? And I think that's partly what Milton was warning against. I mean, Milton was doing many more things than he knew, of course, because he was a poetic genius of incalculable genius. Right. So, well, you've obviously thought about such things very much, so that was a very good question. So, all right, everyone, good night.